The Navy's most advanced warship lay dead in the water. Billion-dollar technology, top engineers, all failed. Then, a retired black mechanic, long forgotten, stepped aboard with just a notebook and a stethoscope. What he did next shocked the entire fleet. The USS Thunderbolt, one of the Navy's most advanced guided missile destroyers, cut through the dark waters of the Pacific with silent precision. Its radar arrays swept the horizon, its combat systems hummed with digital readiness, and its crew moved with the disciplined rhythm of a well-oiled machine. The mission was critical, a high-stakes joint exercise with Allied forces, a demonstration of American naval dominance. Every system had been checked, every protocol followed. There was no reason to expect anything but flawless execution. Then, without warning, the Thunderbolt's engines died. The sudden silence was more alarming than any explosion. The ship's propulsion system, a labyrinth of turbines, sensors, and computer-controlled hydraulics, had simply shut down. The bridge lights flickered as backup power engaged, but the massive vessel was already losing speed, drifting like a ghost in the open ocean. Alarms blared. Screens flashed warnings, and within minutes, the captain was staring at a cascade of error codes that made no sense. The engineering team scrambled. Technicians ran diagnostics, rebooted systems, traced wiring schematics. The ship's log showed no failures, no breaches, no overheating, just an abrupt and total loss of propulsion. The Navy's best minds, trained on the latest digital diagnostics, found nothing. Calls went out to contractors, manufacturers, even other ships in the fleet. No one had an answer. Hours passed. The Thunderbolt was dead in the water, a billion-dollar warship, reduced to a floating husk. The mission was collapsing. Allied forces waited, confusion turning to concern. The longer the ship remained immobilized, the greater the risk, not just to the exercise, but to the Navy's reputation. Every minute cost money, credibility, and strategic advantage. Command was furious. Admirals demanded solutions, but the engineers had none. The problem wasn't in the software logs or the sensor readings. It wasn't a blown fuse or a severed cable. It was something deeper, something invisible to the high-tech tools designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe. The Navy prided itself on cutting-edge technology, on systems so advanced they could predict failures before they happened. Yet here they were, helpless. The Thunderbolt's engines were a masterpiece of modern engineering, but somewhere in that complexity, something fundamental had been overlooked. As frustration mounted, a quiet realization settled over the crew. The problem wasn't just mechanical. It was philosophical. The Navy had built a generation of technicians who trusted screens over sounds, algorithms over intuition. They could interpret data streams, but had forgotten how to listen to the machine itself. And in that silence, the Thunderbolt waited for someone who still knew how. The Navy doesn't like unanswered questions, especially when they come in the form of a billion-dollar warship lying motionless in the middle of the ocean. By the third hour of the Thunderbolt's paralysis, frustration had hardened into desperation. Engineers and the manufacturer were patched in via satellite, scrolling through live diagnostics, their voices tight with confusion. The ship's logs remained stubbornly clean. No critical failures, no system breaches, no obvious reason for the shutdown. Yet the engines refused to respond. Admiral William Hargrove, a career submariner with a reputation for cutting through bureaucracy, stood on the bridge, arms crossed, watching the futile efforts. He had seen ships fail before, mechanical breakdowns, electrical fires, even combat damage. But this was different. This wasn't a failure of hardware or software. It was a failure of understanding. A junior lieutenant, hesitant but determined, approached with suggestion. "Sir, there's someone we could call. Not an engineer, not active duty, but he might know." Hargrove turned, eyebrow raised. The lieutenant explained, a retired Navy mechanic, a master chief who had worked on ships like the Thunderbolt back when they were still being designed. A man who had spent 40 years fixing engines that no one else could. He lived in Norfolk now, out of the service for nearly a decade, but his old colleagues still swore by him. There were immediate objections. The Navy had the best-trained technicians in the world. Contractors with security clearances. Engineers who had built the damn thing. What could a retired mechanic possibly know that they didn't? Hargrove silenced the doubt with single question. Asterisk. Do we have a better idea? Asterisk. The call was made. No formal request. No paperwork. Just a voice on the phone explaining the situation to a man who hadn't worn the uniform in years. There was a pause on the line. Then a quiet, gravelly response. Asterisk. I'll come. Asterisk. No demand for payment. No insistence on recognition. Just a simple acknowledgement of a problem that needed fixing. Within hours, a helicopter touched down on the Thunderbolt S-deck, its rotors whipping salt spray across the steel. Out stepped a figure who looked nothing like the Navy's current generation of technicians. No tablet, no headset, no polished boots. Just an older black man in a worn jacket, carrying a leather satchel that had clearly seen decades of use. His name was Master Chief Raymond Ray Hawkins, and the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like a man who had spent his life listening to machines, suggested he wasn't here to follow procedures. He was here to solve a problem. The crew watched, some skeptical, others curious. A few of the older chiefs recognized him, murmuring to each other. Hawkins ignored the stares. He didn't ask for reports or diagnostics. He didn't even glance at the computer terminals. Instead, he turned to the nearest engineer and said, Asterisk, take me to the engine room. Asterisk, the Navy had spent millions on training, on technology, on systems that were supposed to make ships like the Thunderbolt unsinkable, unbeatable. Yet here they were, relying on a man whose tools were his hands, his ears, and a lifetime of knowledge that no manual could replicate. As Hawkins disappeared below deck, the question hung in the air. Asterisk, could the Navy's past fix its future? The engine room of the Thunderbolt was a cathedral of modern engineering, a maze of turbines, pipes, and flickering control panels, all humming with the latent power of a warship designed to dominate the seas. Yet now it stood silent. Technicians in crisp coveralls hovered near terminals, fingers dancing across touchscreens, their faces illuminated by the glow of error messages they couldn't decipher. The air smelled of oil and ozone, thick with the tension of men who knew they were failing. Then Raymond Hawkins stepped inside. He moved differently than the others. No urgency, no frantic energy. His boots scuffed against the deck plates with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent more time in engine rooms than most of these sailors had been alive. His eyes didn't dart to screens or schematics. Instead, they traced the lines of pipes, the joints of ductwork, the subtle vibrations of machinery that wasn't running. The crew watched him, some with skepticism. What could this old-timer possibly see that their sensors hadn't? Others with cautious hope. One young petty officer, barely out of tech school, whispered to his buddy, "Dude, looks like he's about to check the engine's pulse." Hawkins ignored them. He set his leather satchel down, the same one he'd carried since the Cold War, and pulled out two things, a well-worn stethoscope and a notebook so old its edges had gone soft. The stethoscope wasn't some high-tech diagnostic tool, just a standard medical one, the kind doctors used. The notebook was filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and observations from decades of fixing engines that didn't want to be fixed. He didn't ask for the technical manuals. He didn't request the digital logs. He simply placed the stethoscope against a fuel line and listened. The room held its breath. For nearly 20 minutes, Hawkins worked in silence. He pressed the stethoscope to valves, to pump housings, to the thick steel belly of the turbines themselves. Occasionally, he'd grunt, jot something in his notebook, then move on. The younger engineers exchanged glances. This wasn't how things were done anymore. Modern diagnostics were about data streams, predictive algorithms, real-time monitoring. Not this. One of the Thunderbolt's chief engineers, a lieutenant commander with a master's degree in propulsion systems, finally broke. "Chief, with all due respect, we've already run every diagnostic. The problem isn't mechanical. It's in the control modules. We're waiting on a software patch from." Hawkins held up a hand. Not dismissive, just patient. "Son," he said, "you ever heard an engine lie?" The lieutenant commander blinked. "Sir." Hawkins tapped the stethoscope. "Machines talk. Not in words. In clicks. In hums. In the way pressure moves. Your computers? They just translate. Problem is..." He leaned down, listening again. "Sometimes the translation's wrong." He straightened, wiped grease from his hands, and pointed at a seemingly innocuous junction where two fuel lines met. "There's your problem." The engineers crowded in. There was no visible damage, no warning lights, nothing to suggest an issue. Just a simple coupling, one of hundreds just like it. Hawkins flipped open his notebook, showing a page from years ago, a sketch of an almost identical setup with a handwritten note. "Check secondary valve resonance. Can mimic software fault if harmonics align wrong." The lieutenant commander frowned. "That's not in any of our manuals." Hawkins almost smiled. "Course not. Only happens when three separate systems get just the right kind of unhappy. Last time I saw it? 98 USS Forrestal. Took us a week to figure it out." He reached into his bag one last time and pulled out a small rubber mallet. Without ceremony, he tapped the coupling twice. Somewhere deep in the ship, something clicked. A second later, the Thunderbolt's engines roared back to life. The engineers stared. The lieutenant commander's mouth actually hung open. Hawkins just packed up his tools. Like I said, he muttered, "Sometimes the translation's wrong." And just like that, the Navy's most advanced warship was back in the fight. Not because of cutting-edge technology, but because one old mechanic still remembered how to listen. The sudden revival of the Thunderbolt's engine sent a jolt through the ship, not just through its steel framework, but through the crew itself. The vibration underfoot, the returning hum of power, the flicker of control panels snapping back to life. It all happened in seconds, yet the impact would linger far longer. The engineers who had spent hours buried in diagnostics now stood frozen, staring at the man who had solved their crisis with nothing but a stethoscope, a notebook, and a rubber mallet. The realization settled over them like a slow-rising tide. They had missed something fundamental. Raymond Hawkins didn't gloat. He didn't lecture. He simply closed his notebook and wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag pulled from his pocket. The problem had never been in the software, the sensors, or the fail-safes. It had been in the machine itself. A quirk of physics, a resonance mismatch between fuel pressure and valve timing that no algorithm had been programmed to catch. The computers had interpreted the symptoms as a cascade of unrelated errors, sending engineers chasing ghosts through the ship systems. But Hawkins had known better. He had listened. Modern naval engineering had trained its technicians to trust data over instinct. Every system had redundancies. Every component had a digital twin, and every failure was supposed to announce itself with error codes and automated alerts. But Hawkins understood something that had been lost in the shift to automation. Machines speak in more than just data. They groan. They shudder. They settle into rhythms and break them in ways that numbers alone can't explain. The Thunderbolt hadn't been broken. It had been talking. And for days, no one had been listening. One of the junior engineers, a fresh-faced specialist who had spent the crisis buried in diagnostic logs, finally found his voice. "How did you know?" Hawkins glanced at him. "Same way you know when someone's lying to you," he said. "You hear it in their voice." The answer was deceptively simple. The Thunderbolt propulsion system wasn't just a collection of parts. It was an ecosystem of moving pieces, each with its own language. The high-pressure fuel pumps had a particular whine when they were straining. The turbine bearings clicked in a specific pattern when lubricant flow was ideal. The exhaust dampeners had a steady, almost imperceptible shudder when aligned correctly, a rhythm Hawkins had learned decades ago, back when engineers had diagnosed problems by ear and touch because the computers weren't advanced enough to do it for them. That knowledge hadn't become obsolete. It had just been forgotten. The lieutenant commander in charge of the engineering team exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "We ran every diagnostic, every test. None of it pointed here." Hawkins nodded. "Diagnostics are good at telling you what's wrong when they know what to look for," he said. "But they ain't so good at figuring out what they don't know." He tapped his temple. "That's your job." The lesson was clear. Technology was a tool, not a replacement for understanding. The Navy had spent years refining its systems to eliminate human error, but in doing so, it had also eliminated human intuition. The crew of the Thunderbolt had been trained to troubleshoot within the boundaries of their manuals, to follow protocols rather than question them. Hawkins hadn't followed a protocol. He had listened to the ship, to its history, to the quiet anomalies that didn't fit the expected patterns. As the engineers began recalibrating the system, ensuring the resonance issue wouldn't recur, a quiet shift took place in the room. The initial skepticism had melted into something else. Respect, yes, but also a dawning awareness of a gap in their own training. They had been taught to operate the Navy's most advanced systems, but not to understand them in the way Hawkins did. One of the senior chiefs, a grizzled veteran who had seen his share of engine room miracles, summed it up best. "We got so good at reading the manual," he muttered. "We forgot how to read the machine." Hawkins didn't disagree. He just shouldered his satchel and prepared to leave. His work was done. The Thunderbolt was back online. The mission could proceed, and the Navy could return to its business. But the real fix, the one that would last, wasn't just in the engine. It was in the minds of the men and women who now understood that sometimes the most advanced solution wasn't a piece of technology. It was paying attention. The reactivation of the Thunderbolt's propulsion system should have been the end of the crisis. The engines were running, power was restored, and the ship could resume its mission. Yet for those who had witnessed Raymond Hawkins' diagnosis, the moment carried a weight far beyond mechanical repair. It was a confrontation, not just with a faulty engine, but with an uncomfortable truth about modern expertise. The Navy had built its reputation on precision. Every system aboard the Thunderbolt had been designed, tested, and refined to eliminate uncertainty. Its engineers were trained to approach problems methodically, relying on diagnostic tools that translated mechanical behavior into data streams, error codes, and predictive alerts. The assumption was clear. Technology had rendered old-school intuition obsolete. Hawkins had just proven that assumption wrong. His solution, a few precise taps on a fuel line coupling, hadn't required firmware updates or system overrides. It hadn't even required tools beyond a stethoscope and a rubber mallet. The fix was so simple it bordered on absurdity, and that simplicity was what stung. For days, teams of engineers had chased digital ghosts, convinced the problem lay in some corrupted subroutine or sense of malfunction. None had considered that the issue might be physical, immediate, and obvious, if only they'd known how to look. The lieutenant commander who had initially dismissed Hawkins' approach now stood silently in the engine room, arms crossed, staring at the coupling that had caused a cascade failure. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the struggle beneath. This wasn't just a lesson in mechanical engineering. It was a reckoning. Across the Navy, similar scenarios had played out before, just never with stakes this high. Veterans swapped stories about old chiefs who could diagnose engine trouble by the smell of the exhaust or the pitch of a whine, but those tales were treated as folklore, not fact. The Navy's institutional confidence had shifted to its systems, its protocols, its layers of digital oversight. Human instinct was viewed as a fallback, not a frontline tool. Yet here was a reality. The Thunderbolt's computers had missed what a retired mechanic caught in minutes. One of the younger engineers, a specialist who had spent the crisis buried in diagnostic logs, finally voiced a question gnawing at the room. Why didn't the system flag this? There are sensors monitoring every inch of these fuel lines. Hawkins didn't look up from repacking his satchel. Sensors look for what they're told to look for, he said. This wasn't a failure. It was a conversation. The distinction was critical. The resonance mismatch between the fuel valves and the pump harmonics hadn't triggered any standard failure modes. The vibrations had fallen within acceptable thresholds. The pressure readings hadn't spiked or dropped, and no components had overheated. The system hadn't malfunctioned. It had adapted, compensating in ways that masked the root issue while creating secondary anomalies that sent engineers chasing false leads. Hawkins had recognized the pattern because he'd encountered it before, decades earlier, on an older class of ship where engineers had no choice but to rely on tactile and auditory feedback. That knowledge, once commonplace, had faded from institutional memory as the Navy modernized. The Thunderbolt's designers had accounted for countless failure scenarios, but not this one, because the last person who understood it had retired years ago. The lieutenant commander exhaled sharply. So we're saying the fix for a next-gen warship was in a handwritten notebook from the 90s? Hawkins shrugged. The fix was in the engine. The notebook just remembered where to look. Silence settled over the group. The implications were uncomfortable. The Navy had invested billions in making its fleet smarter, more connected, more automated. Yet when faced with a novel problem, the solution had come from analog experience. Not because the new systems were flawed, but because no system could anticipate every possible interaction between mechanical components operating under real-world conditions. The takeaway wasn't that technology had failed. It was that technology alone wasn't enough. As Hawkins prepared to leave, the lieutenant commander stopped him. "This resonance issue, we need to document it. Update the manuals. Make sure it doesn't happen again." Hawkins nodded, but his expression suggested he knew the truth. Manuals could only capture what had already been learned. The next crisis might not be in his notebook. The real lesson wasn't about a specific fix. It was about humility, the understanding that no matter how advanced the systems became, there would always be gaps only experience could bridge. The Thunderbolt's engines thrummed steadily now, their rhythm once again the heartbeat of the ship. The crew could return to their duties, the mission could proceed, and the Navy could check another box in the long list of operational victories. But in the quiet of the engine room, the moment lingered. They had fixed the ship. The question was whether they'd learned from it. The Thunderbolt was operational again, its systems humming with restored precision. But the true significance of Raymond Hawkins' repair extended far beyond the engine room. What had appeared to be a straightforward mechanical fix was, in reality, a clash between two philosophies of problem-solving, one rooted in data, the other in deep familiarity. The Navy had spent years refining its approach to diagnostics, creating layers of digital oversight designed to eliminate uncertainty. Yet, when faced with a problem that fell outside expected parameters, those systems had faltered, while Hawkins' instincts had not. The difference lay in how knowledge was acquired. Modern engineers were trained to interpret data. They understood schematics, diagnostic codes, and system redundancies. They could navigate software interfaces faster than any generation before them. But Hawkins operated from a different foundation, one built on tactile memory, on years of feeling vibrations to metal, of recognizing shifts in sound and pressure that no sensor could quantify. His expertise wasn't just about knowing how the system worked. It was about knowing how it felt when it was working right, and more importantly, how it felt when it wasn't. This distinction became glaringly obvious in the hours following the repair. Engineers pored over the resonance issue Hawkins had identified, cross-referencing it with the ship's technical manuals. The anomaly wasn't documented. The coupling in question had never been flagged as a potential failure point in any simulation or stress test. The reason was simple. The problem wasn't the result of a single component failing. It was a product of an interaction, a harmonic mismatch between the fuel pump's frequency and the natural vibration of the valve assembly. Under most conditions, the two systems operated independently enough to avoid interference. But at specific RPMs, under precise pressure conditions, their vibrations could align in a way that created a feedback loop, tricking the sensors into interpreting the resonance as a software glitch rather than a mechanical one. Hawkins hadn't solved the issue through abstract reasoning. He'd recognized the pattern his hands and ears remembered from decades earlier, aboard ships where engineers couldn't rely on diagnostic screens. That knowledge hadn't been preserved in any manual, because it wasn't the kind of knowledge that could be easily transcribed. It was learned through repetition, through troubleshooting failures that never made it into official reports, through the kind of hands-on experience that modern training pipelines no longer prioritized. The Navy's shift toward digital diagnostics wasn't misguided. It was necessary. Modern warships were too complex, too interdependent, to rely solely on human intuition. But the Thunderbolt incident revealed the unintended consequence of that shift, the erosion of sensory expertise. Engineers no longer needed to listen to an engine to understand it. They could just read the output from accelerometers and pressure sensors. That reliance had blinded them to the possibility that the problem might lie outside the scope of what the sensors were programmed to detect. In the aftermath, conversations rippled through the crew. Some dismissed Hawkins' fix as a fluke, a lucky break from a bygone era. But others, particularly the older chiefs, understood the deeper lesson. Technology was a tool, not a replacement for judgment. Systems could monitor, they could alert, they could even predict, but they couldn't improvise. They couldn't hear the hesitation in a pump's whine or feel the slight irregularity in a bearing's rotation. Those nuances required a human touch, one that had been sidelined in the name of progress. The lieutenant commander who had initially doubted Hawkins now faced an uncomfortable truth. The Navy's pursuit of efficiency had come at the cost of resilience. By streamlining training to focus on digital interfaces, they had inadvertently created a generation of technicians who could navigate software but couldn't interrogate machinery. The Thunderbolt hadn't just suffered mechanical failure. It had exposed a gap in institutional knowledge. Hawkins, for his part, offered no grand speeches. When asked how often these kinds of undocumented interactions occurred, he simply said, "Often enough." The unspoken implication was clear. There were likely other quirks, other hidden failure modes that hadn't yet been encountered, or worse, had been forgotten. The challenge now was whether the Navy would reintegrate that kind of wisdom into its modern framework. Could it find a way to marry cutting-edge diagnostics with the kind of sensory expertise Hawkins embodied? Or would each lesson like this one have to be relearned the hard way? As the Thunderbolt powered forward, its course corrected, and its mission back on track, those questions lingered. The engines ran smoothly, the systems reported no further anomalies, and the crew returned to their routines. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The ship had been repaired. The real question was whether the system would be. The Thunderbolt's engines were running, but the reverberations of Raymond Hawkins' fix extended far beyond the mechanical. What began as a routine systems failure had morphed into something more profound, an institutional wake-up call. The Navy prided itself on being the most technologically advanced maritime force in history, yet its most sophisticated destroyer had been immobilized by an issue that defied its own diagnostics. Worse, the solution hadn't come from a team of engineers with top-tier security clearances or a contractor's emergency response unit. It had come from a retired mechanic whose tools were deemed obsolete a decade ago. For the officers and crew, this reality was difficult to reconcile. The Navy had spent billions on predictive maintenance systems, AI-driven diagnostics, and fail-safes designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic failure. Every component on the Thunderbolt was monitored. Every system had redundancies, and every possible failure mode had been simulated during the ship's design phase. Yet none of that had mattered when faced with a problem that existed outside the parameters of programmed expectations. The lieutenant commander who had initially dismissed Hawkins' methods now found himself grappling with an uncomfortable truth. The Navy's over-reliance on technology had created blind spots. It wasn't that the systems were flawed. They were, in fact, extraordinarily capable, but they were only as good as the humans who designed and interpreted them. When an issue fell outside the scope of anticipated failures, the diagnostics couldn't adapt. They could only report what they'd been programmed to see. Hawkins hadn't been bound by those limitations. His approach wasn't constrained by protocol because his expertise wasn't rooted in manuals. It was rooted in experience. He understood not just how the systems were supposed to work, but how they actually worked in real-world conditions, where resonance and unforeseen interactions could create problems no simulation could predict. That kind of knowledge couldn't be downloaded or algorithmically replicated. It had to be earned. Through years of hands-on engagement, through failures and fixes that never made it into official documentation. In the hours following the repair, a quiet but intense debrief unfolded among the Thunderbolt's senior engineers. They reviewed Hawkins' diagnosis, retracing the steps he had taken. The resonance issue, once identified, was undeniably real, yet had eluded every diagnostic tool at their disposal. Why? Because the sensors monitoring the fuel system had been programmed to watch for pressure drops, temperature spikes, or flow irregularities, not for the specific harmonic mismatch that had caused the valves to behave erratically. The system hadn't failed to detect a problem. It failed to recognize that a problem existed in the first place. This revelation forced a reckoning. The Navy's move toward automation and digitization wasn't wrong. It was essential for maintaining a technological edge. But in its pursuit of efficiency, the institution had allowed certain human skills to atrophy. Engineers no longer learned to diagnose issues by sound or touch because the assumption was that sensors would always catch what human senses might miss. The Thunderbolt incident proved the opposite could also be true. The Admiral who had authorized Hawkins' involvement summarized it bluntly in a private conversation with the ship's command staff. We didn't just lose the ability to fix this problem the old way. We lost the ability to see it. That loss carried strategic implications. In a conflict scenario, where systems might be degraded or compromised by adversarial action, the ability to troubleshoot outside prescribed protocols could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. If the next generation of sailors only knew how to operate within the confines of digital diagnostics, they would be ill-prepared for scenarios where those diagnostics were unavailable or, worse, deliberately manipulated. The question now was whether the Navy would take this lesson to heart. Would it find ways to preserve and integrate the kind of tactile, experiential knowledge Hawkins embodied? Or would this incident be filed away as an anomaly, a curious footnote in the Thunderbolt service history? For Hawkins, the answer was simple. As he prepared to disembark, he was asked if he thought the Navy still valued what he represented. His response was characteristically direct. Depends, they'd rather be right or ready. The Thunderbolt sailed on, its systems restored, its mission back on track. But somewhere in the hum of its engines, in the vibration of steel and the interplay of unseen forces, a quieter truth persisted. Technology could make the Navy faster, smarter, and more precise. But only wisdom could make it resilient. The Thunderbolt resumed its mission, its systems restored, its crew returning to the rhythm of duty. But the implications of Raymond Hawkins' intervention lingered long after the ship's engines roared back to life. His weathered notebook, filled with decades of handwritten observations, had done more than diagnose a mechanical failure. It had exposed a vulnerability in the Navy's institutional knowledge. The resonance issue wasn't just a fluke. It was proof that critical expertise had been allowed to fade, undocumented and unpreserved, because the systems designed to replace human intuition had gaps no one anticipated. Hawkins represented a generation of engineers who understood machines in ways that couldn't be fully digitized. His knowledge wasn't just about technical specifications. It was about the intangible nuances of mechanical behavior. The way a particular pump sounded when its bearings were wearing thin, the subtle vibration pattern of a fuel line on the verge of a pressure surge, the faint metallic scent of overheating alloy that preceded a failure. These were diagnostic tools no sensor could replicate because they weren't just data points. They were instincts honed through repetition, through trial and error, through years of listening when machines spoke in whispers rather than error codes. The Navy had assumed this kind of expertise was obsolete. Modern diagnostics were faster, more precise, and less prone to human bias. But the Thunderbolt incident revealed the flaw in that assumption. Systems could only diagnose what they were programmed to recognize. When faced with an emergent problem, one created by the unpredictable interaction of components rather than the failure of any single part, the technology had no frame of reference. Hawkins did. His notebook wasn't just a personal journal. It was a living archive of edge cases, undocumented quirks, and solutions that existed outside official manuals. In the days following the repair, discussion spread to the Navy's engineering corps. How many other fixes, other workarounds, other bits of hard-won wisdom had retired with men like Hawkins? How many potential crises were lurking in systems everyone assumed were fully understood? The Thunderbolt's resonance issue hadn't been a design flaw. It was an unknown unknown, a problem that hadn't been predicted because the conditions that created it were so rare. Yet rarity was an impossibility. And in complex systems, rare interactions became inevitable over time. The Navy's challenge now was preservation. Technical manuals documented standard procedures, expected failures, and approved solutions. But they didn't capture the improvisations, the tricks of the trade, the intuitive leaps that experienced engineers developed over years of hands-on work. That knowledge had traditionally been passed down through mentorship, through war stories traded in engine rooms, through the slow accumulation of institutional memory. But as the Navy modernized, that organic transfer had broken down. New engineers were trained on simulators and diagnostic software, not on the physical machines themselves. The result was a generation of technicians who could navigate digital interfaces flawlessly, but had never developed the tactile familiarity their predecessors took for granted. Some within the Navy recognized the danger. Proposals began circulating, an effort to document oral histories from retiring engineers, a database of non-standard fixes, even a return to apprenticeship-style training to ensure hands-on intuition wasn't lost entirely. But these initiatives faced institutional inertia. The Navy's culture prioritized measurable skills, certifiable competencies, and scalable training pipelines. Instinct wasn't quantifiable. Experience couldn't be downloaded. And wisdom, by its nature, resisted systematization. Hawkins himself seemed unsurprised by the debate. When asked if the Navy could realistically preserve what he knew, he offered a weary smile. "You can't put 40 years of listening into a PowerPoint," he said. The unspoken truth was that expertise like his couldn't be fully captured, only earned. The best the Navy could do was create structures that allowed the next generation to develop their own instincts, rather than relying entirely on algorithms to do the thinking for them. As the Thunderbolt cut through the waves, its mission back on track, its systems once again reporting all normal, the deeper lesson remained. The Navy's strength had always been its people as much as its technology. Men like Hawkins hadn't just maintained machines. They'd understood them in ways that transcended schematics. That understanding had saved a mission and potentially a ship. The question now was whether the Navy would remember that lesson the next time it mattered. The Thunderbolt's engines hummed smoothly as the ship resumed its course, the crisis officially resolved. But the true significance of the incident extended far beyond the mechanical fix. What began as a propulsion failure had revealed a deeper truth about expertise, institutional memory, and the often overlooked value of wisdom in an age of automation. The Navy had invested billions in cutting-edge technology, yet when faced with a problem outside the expected parameters, the solution came not from algorithms or diagnostics, but from a retired mechanic's intuition, an intuition forged through decades of hands-on experience. The real victory wasn't just that the ship was operational again. It was the Navy's reluctant acknowledgement that no system, no matter how advanced, could fully replace human judgment. Technology excelled at handling known variables, but it struggled with the unpredictable, the emergent, the idiosyncratic, precisely the kind of challenges that arise in real-world conditions. Hawkins' fix had been simple, almost laughably so, yet it had eluded the best diagnostic tools because it wasn't a failure of parts, but of interaction. That distinction mattered. It underscored the limitations of relying solely on data-driven solutions and highlighted the irreplaceable role of experiential knowledge. In the aftermath, conversations rippled through the ranks. Some dismissed the incident as an anomaly, a quirk of outdated machinery, but others recognized a warning. Expertise wasn't just about knowing the rules. It was about knowing when the rules didn't apply. The Navy's greatest strength had always been its people, not just its technology. Systems could be hacked, degraded, or rendered obsolete. Instincts, honed through years of practice, couldn't. The challenge now was balance. The Navy couldn't, and shouldn't, abandon its technological edge, but it could no longer afford to let human intuition atrophy. The lesson of the Thunderbolt was clear. Progress shouldn't mean discarding hard-won wisdom in the name of efficiency. The real victory would come when the institution learned to merge the best of both worlds, harnessing the speed and precision of modern systems, while preserving the adaptability and insight of those who still knew how to listen when machines spoke in ways data couldn't capture. The ship sailed on, its mission back on track. But somewhere in the vibration of its hull, in the quiet hum of its restored engines, lingered a reminder: the future belongs to those who master technology, but the edge belongs to those who still understand the machine. This is the power of experience, when wisdom outsmarts technology. If this story hit you like it hit us, smash that like button, subscribe for more real-life legends, and let us know in the comments. Should the Navy bring back old-school mechanics as advisors? Ship light bulb.